I'm I am a Dead Sea Scrolls scholar. I did my PhD at the University of Manchester under Professor George Brooke, and my specialization is early Jewish texts and history and the Dead Sea Scrolls. And I am probably most familiar to people through two venues. I run a YouTube channel under my own name where I talk about uh, biblical scholarship and the Dead Sea Scrolls, and I do a lot of counter apologetics. And I was also one of the members of the team that uncovered forgeries in the Museum of the Bible and in the Scoia'tael collection of Dead Sea Scrolls fragments back between like 2015 and 2020.
Well, I'm an independent researcher and author. I got my start in the 1990s with some major articles on the Dead Sea Scrolls, the War Scroll in specific. And then starting in the 2000s, I have published a series of books and articles on the Greek sources in the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament. And that's mostly what I've been involved with in the last couple of decades.
Generally speaking, Dead Sea Scrolls are any manuscript that was discovered in the region of the Judean desert um, on the western shore of the Dead Sea. So that includes a number of manuscript discoveries from Qumran to Matsada to Mirabat to Nachal Hever to Nachal Tzadir. There's there's more than just what tend to be properly called the Dead Sea Scrolls. There's a lot of texts, but when people talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls, what they're focusing on are the finds from 11 caves that are located within a 1.5 kilometer proximity to a site called Qumran, which appears to be a type of religious retreat or some sort of religious community.
Yes, the Dead Sea Scrolls were found starting around 1945. They were ancient scrolls that were found in a series of caves overlooking the Dead Sea between modern Israel and Jordan. There was an archaeological site named Qumran that was occupied in the 2nd century, 1st century BC, and the caves are basically associated with that location.
So from the 2nd century that existed from about the 2nd century BC up to the 1st century CE. So 250, 300 years in and around the time of Jesus, in and around the time of the Hasmonean kingdom and the Roman occupation of Judah, there was this community. In total, there are tens of thousands of individual manuscript fragments. Scholars have reconstructed these into about 800 or 900 individual manuscripts, all dated between roughly 250 BCE and 100 CE, a large number of which contain quote unquote biblical text, but there's so much more there. There's copies of popular other forms of popular Jewish literature, such as the books of Enoch, the books of Jubilees, things like the Testaments of the 12 Patriarchs, and compositions that we never knew of before. Things like the Chodayot, or the Thanksgiving songs, so-called apocryphons of Joshua and Jeremiah, a text that look like the book of Ezekiel or look like the book of Daniel, but aren't these things. And then lots and lots and lots of what we call sectarian texts or rule texts, which look like rules for governing the community that collected this literature.
So they date from about maybe 250 BC down to the late 1st century BC. The latest ones are maybe 50, 40, 30 BC. There are a large number of ancient biblical texts there, including, there's some of the most ancient preserved texts of the Bible in the world. So they're significant for that respect. There were also a number of texts from a basically unknown Jewish sect that had their own set of religious scruples, and they had their own organizational principles and communities. So the product of a certain thing, and the collection also contains Jewish pseudepigraphal works like Jubilees and Enoch, and some of the works that are familiar that aren't from the Jewish Bible, but they're kind of related. So a very amazing manuscript find in at least 11 different caves, and they've been studied intensively ever since the 40s to the present.
So these were a group of Jews who were highly literate, who had chosen to separate themselves from the Jerusalem temple establishment and form their own community, in which they patiently awaited the arrival of the last days, when Yahweh would come and finally overthrow the forces of evil and the rule of Belial.
Well, no, because they were all written, over a century before the time of Jesus. There is one scholar, Robert Eisenman, who in the 60s, he suggested that it was written in the time of the New Testament. There are all sorts of mysterious figures in the Dead Sea Scrolls. The teacher of righteousness, the wicked priest, the man of lies. And he had them all identified with, John the Baptist or Jesus or this and that. And his methods were so questionable, because if it matched something in the New Testament, he said, that proves that, this is when it was written. And if it was exact opposite of what is said in the New Testament, they said, well, this is polemics against the Dead Sea Scrolls. So heads you win, tails you lose.
This part to cover. Jesus is not mentioned in the Dead Sea Scrolls. What Christians who are telling you this are probably getting at is that within many, not all, but within many of the Dead Sea Scrolls, there is a reflection of the type of Jewish messianic expectation that we see in the New Testament, but also reflected within the community that collected this literature. So there's a handful of manuscripts, such as 4Q 521. This is a manuscript that came from Cave 4, one of these 11 caves in the area, which predicts the arrival of a Messiah who reflects several of the same criteria as was applied to Jesus. Other texts, such as the so-called Testimonia 4Q174, does the same thing. Something like the Aramaic so-called Son of God text 4Q246 speaks of the Messiah of Israel as a son of God. And, the Christians will latch onto this as a means to show that Jesus owns self-identification, if he ever even did self-identify as the Son of God. Certainly the New Testament authors, the later New Testament authors who identified Jesus as the Son of God, were not just drawing this out of a Greco-Roman religious milieu, but it shows that there was also this type of thinking already prevalent, at least within this one segment of Judaism. That's the best that we can say about Jesus in the Dead Sea Scrolls. He's never mentioned by name. The group that wrote and collected the Dead Sea Scrolls were not Christians. They were not the forerunners of Christianity. So that's as much as we can say about that. The problem, however, arises when we look into the individual manuscripts themselves. There are numerous copies of individual biblical books, such as, Exodus or Genesis or Psalms or Isaiah. And among just the copies that they collected, we see pretty dramatic textual differences. So while they were fond of many of these books that later came to be included in the Bible, they also had a tolerance for pretty dramatic textual plurality differences within the text themselves.
Well, there's a number of biblical texts. For instance, there's a very complete text of Isaiah that's 24 feet long. I mean, it contains the majority of the book. All of these scrolls have, the edges are tattered, and so there are gaps in the text and missing parts. So, and there's fragments of pretty much all the other biblical books from Genesis, through Malachi, with a couple exceptions. Not all these texts conform to the standard text that we have today, the Masoretic text. Some of them are closer to the Samaritan version of the Old Testament. Some of them are closer to the Septuagint translation, which is the Greek translation made at Alexandria. And there's a number of variant, a lot of biblical variants, and a lot of rewritten Bible. There's books of Joshua and books of this and that are pretty divergent from the existing biblical text. So it really shows that the biblical text was fluid. There was different versions, a lot of rewriting, additions. There were additional stories from Jeremiah and Daniel, and it gives a snapshot as to what was going on back then with the biblical, and it wasn't all just one standard approved Bible. It's been intensively studied to both enhance our knowledge of what the original text might have looked like, and also to show that there were a lot of variations.
Right. And I mean, one of the things that the Dead Sea Scrolls have done for scholars and for biblical scholarship, which is great, is it's helped to really provide a lot of clarity into the transmission of manuscripts, which came to be included within the Bible, and this is a good case of this. Uh, what survives in what we call the Masoretic text, which is the standard Hebrew text of the Old Testament, what survives there is probably a scribal mistake, a textual variant, insofar as the height for Goliath. And we have I think it's at least one. There might be a couple of copies in the Dead Sea Scrolls where there is a different reading, and based on the way the text reads, we can see a scribe just misread this and miscopied it, and as a result, this became the standard version. So we can group individual manuscripts together, and we can set them I guess on a spectrum, an historical spectrum or a textual spectrum, to show how the text itself developed. This here that I have on my screen, this is a fragment from another copy of the book of Samuel from the Dead Sea Scrolls. And this preserves a full extra paragraph in the story of Saul's defeat of Nachash, the king of the Ammonites, at Yabesh Gilead in 1 Samuel, I think it's 1 Samuel 11. I might get that wrong, but I think that's where it is. So this fragment has actually, like, for the first time since its discovery, shown scholars an earlier form of the text that was lost in the process of textual transmission that took place over hundreds of years after the first century.
A friend of mine, Craig Dowdner, he was a friend of Robert Eisman at the time, and he was very instrumental in getting these Dead Sea Scrolls radiocarbon tested. He worked with other experts, and it was his initiative really that got the first radiocarbon test done, which showed that some of the scrolls that Eisenman dated to the New Testament time, they were like 50 or 100 BC. It just ruled out Eisenman's theories. He was furious. It led to a falling out between the two because, but he's continued to write book after book after book with this basically discredited premise. Some of his scholarship is good, but not when he starts putting the Dead Sea Scrolls in the 1st century AD.
So I think that the motive behind this was fiduciary. It was a pure profit motive. These individual fragments, the forgeries of the Dead Sea Scrolls that were sold between roughly 1996 and 2014. These fragments are very small. Most of them, smaller than the size of a credit card, contain only a handful of words. And they're all, copies of what we now recognize as Bible. They all sold for literally hundreds of thousands of dollars. The Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, who purchased 9 of these fragments, allocated, I think it was upwards of $2 million US to purchase 9 tiny little fragments of these manuscripts. So there was a very obvious profit motive at work, and I think the forgers themselves, recognizing or attempting, I guess, doing their best to capitalize on the market and to get the best bang for their buck, targeted evangelical institutions. Most of the purchasers: Southwestern Baptist, Azusa Pacific University, Martin Skoyen, who is a Norwegian collector. I don't know if he identifies himself as an evangelical, but he's certainly, based on my interactions with him and what I've seen from him in the press and in his own writing, certainly considers himself a serious Christian on some level. I think the forgers recognized this is I guess, the softest entry point for them into the market. If they could convince wealthy evangelicals to own a piece of the Bible that Jesus read, they were going to make a lot of money. So much so that it almost didn't matter what the text was. Like, several of these fragments are what I would consider pretty benign. You know, things like there's a forgery from the book of Nehemiah, chapter 3, which talks about the wall that Nehemiah built around the city of Jerusalem. It's, from a doctrinal standpoint, it's not of any value. From a textual standpoint, it's a very, very limited value, especially since this fragment itself doesn't tell us much of anything different from, you know, the other witnesses to the text of scripture that we have. The forgers were smart in recognizing that it didn't even matter what they were selling, so long as it was part of the Bible.
Well, the Masoretic text, they've tracked the manuscripts of the Bible from the Dead Sea, as well as some in the Bar Kokhba rebellion period in the 100s AD. And anyway, the upshot is that the Masoretic text was finalized probably in the 1st century AD. Before then, it was very fluid, a lot of variations. So we don't really know exactly what the original text was. So therefore, it's hard to say that every word that we have today is inspired, because we don't even know if that was the original text. And in some cases, we have improved reading because of some of the Dead Sea Scrolls. So the situation is much more complex. People like a very simplified worldview, where you can read one book, every word is inspired, and that's all you have to know about the world. But it's, you know, the facts on the ground are much more complex. So just from a textual point of view, it kind of calls into question the whole premise of how can every word be inspired when we don't know every word? Plus the vowel points. The vowels weren't invented until many centuries after the time of Jesus, say. So it isn't 100% certain what the meaning of the Hebrew is in some cases, even when you have the ancient text, because the same set of consonants can mean several different words in, you know, modern Hebrew.
So, I mean, I think this is a question that different scholars are going to answer differently. I mean, I went to when I did my master's degree, I went to an evangelical university, and some of my professors were strong proponents and adherence to the idea of the infallibility of the scriptures, but there's various ways to, I guess, to accommodate that in view of the manuscript evidence. You know, most evangelicals will step back and just say, well, infallibility exists only insofar as the autographs are concerned, the original documents, right? But then this raises all sorts of problematic questions about what an original copy even is, and how we would even know it if we ever found one, which we haven't yet. So, but for me personally, it is extremely problematic. And the reason is because what the Dead Sea Scrolls do, in large part, is illustrate to us not just the changing shape of the text of scripture, but also the reasons behind how that happened. Much of it is accidental. Scribes are not perfect. Excuse me. And they make mistakes all the time in their efforts to copy these things. And then these mistakes are repeated by future scribes without even realizing that they're making them. And I think this is a problem. This creates all sorts of issues with the idea of an infallible text. But that's not all. I mean, something else that we see quite clearly within the Dead Sea Scrolls are intentional theological decisions being made about the text and what to copy, what not to copy, and what to change or to correct. One of the oldest copies, one of the oldest manuscripts in the Dead Sea Scrolls is a copy of the book of Jeremiah that dates as far back as 200 or 250 BCE. And in this manuscript is it follows the text basically through chapter 7 of Jeremiah up to the end of verse 28, and then it stops. And then the original scribe continued with chapter 8, verse 4. So what you have here in this manuscript is the total absence of, I think is it 7 or 8 verses of text that appear in every single one of our other known ancient editions. It appears in the Septuagint. It appears in every manuscript of the Masoretic text. It's everywhere. But here in this one manuscript, this oldest copy of Jeremiah that we have, it's missing. Now, the way that we date the manuscripts is by a careful analysis of the style of the handwriting. So in the margins of this manuscript, another scribe writing about 100 years later. So if you think about that, this would be like a book having been published in the 1920s and someone now coming along and adding to it. Another scribe has come along and added all the missing text that we know from our existing copies of scripture in the margins. Now, a handful of scholars have suggested this is a mistake at the outset that is being corrected by a later scribe. And I don't buy it. I and a number of other scholars who deal with this particular manuscript look at this and go, it seems impossible that a scribe could have made a mistake to eliminate what amounts to about a half a column of material. The text flows seamlessly without what's been added. And it's astonishing that this would have survived for 100 years without anybody ever thinking to make the correction until much, much later. So what we have in this manuscript, this Dead Sea Scroll manuscript, is clear evidence of a scribe making the independent decision to change the text, to add to the text, the so-called holy word of God. And then you have other texts within the Dead Sea Scrolls. One of the things that frustrates me to no end as a scholar interested in these texts is how they have been classified and organized over the first 75 years of their publication as a pretty much as a I guess a necessity. The first scholars dealing with the Dead Sea Scrolls, because there was so much material, chose to distinguish between them according to the categories that we know. So they started by sifting through the material and just separating stuff that was quote unquote Bible from stuff that was not Bible. Now, over the course of the last number of decades, we've come to recognize that this is a very, very artificial separation. And many things that got separated out as non-biblical are actually forms of the biblical text that are so different from what survives that they don't really fit our textual classification. There's a whole group of manuscripts that for a long time was known as reworked Pentateuch. These were manuscripts that were a form of the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, the Pentateuch, but so dramatically different from any other version, any other ancient version of this work that they didn't fit. They didn't fit within the existing classificatory scheme. And as a result, it became known as quote unquote reworked, as if, a scribe had the Pentateuch in front of him and just freely, rewrote it as he was reading it. The scholarship on this, the opinion on this has changed. And these texts are now more commonly known as just 4Q Pentateuch. And the reason being because we've come to a recognition that these have just as much claim to be quote unquote biblical or scriptural or forms of the Pentateuch as any of these other copies of the text. It's a very, very complicated picture. It's one that scholars have been painstakingly working through for 50 years now or more. And it's one that's still going to take a lot of time for us to really get a good handle on in terms of, how these manuscripts really relate to and inform the biblical text.
Yes, the Dead Sea Scrolls were written and preserved by a specialized community. There were different communities, each of which had their set of cherished texts. And, the text of the Bible probably varied from one community to another. We know that in the case of the Samaritans, they had an 11th commandment that said that Mount Gerizim, their temple, was the only place to worship. And, their version of the Pentateuch differs from the Masoretic. But the people at Qumran, they had their own set of texts, and maybe the Sadducees did, and maybe the Pharisees did, and other groups that seem that we don't even know about. So these texts were in the possession of certain communities, and probably underwent changes as a result. And we managed to have our Jewish Bible is the one transmitted by one community during the 1st century AD, but we don't know what variants disappeared.
The question you raised was about the Bible and the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the suggestion that the Dead Sea Scrolls preserve the oldest form of the Bible that we have. This is a complicated question, and the reason it is complicated is because among the Dead Sea Scrolls, we have somewhere between 220 to 300 copies of individual biblical books. And I say biblical books as those which eventually came to be included in the Christian and the Jewish canons. Now, it's important to note at the outset that the canonization of the Old Testament is something that occurred after the period in which the Dead Sea Scrolls were written and collected. So we see a group of so-called scriptural texts which seem important to the collectors and the writers of the Dead Sea Scrolls. But there are varying opinions among scholars as to how to think about all of these things. In my best attempts to simplify this, I will say we generally agree that for the writers and the collectors of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Torah, the so-called 5 books of Moses, were probably viewed by them as some form of scripture, that is, some form of authoritative writing. And a number of the prophets, such as Isaiah, or several of the prophets from the Book of the 12, these are the 12 minor prophets, or Ezekiel, they probably considered these also scripture containing the words of God. But several of the texts, even though they had copies of them, they obviously didn't think very highly of them. Books like 1st and 2nd Kings, or 1st and 2nd Chronicles, or the books of Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, these things, there was only a handful, small little fragments of these surviving the Dead Sea Scrolls, texts that they obviously did not pay very close attention to. The other thing that we find in the Dead Sea Scrolls are lots of other books which were at least as influential and popular. Things like the books of 1st Enoch, the books of Jubilees, the Book of Jubilees, and a number of other texts that we either knew or just learned about that were written during the Second Temple period. So all this to say, it's a complicated question with a complicated answer. If you reduce your selecting criteria to, just a particular grouping of texts, it's possible to say that this is the oldest copy of the Bible that we have.
Well, there are some very ancient texts that were discovered. So that's a very attractive fact, I think, to people who want to believe in the inerrancy of the Bible. It's an ancient work, fairly ancient, and if you have a belief system, you tend to want to gather every possible fact in support of those beliefs and filter out anything that's inconsistent. So, the ancient biblical texts, the Dead Sea Scrolls, archaeology, all of this is, information to be mined in support of any given belief system. So, that's my initial take. I'm more into ancient history and textual criticism and things in archaeology than modern religious belief systems. But I can at least comment on that.
Yeah.
And there are true believers among scholars too. There's every form of belief system, whether it's academic, political, religious, UFOs, or not to associate those, but they're all similar in a lot of ways. You get to see the same patterns of psychological commitment, um, cognitive biases, and filtering of information, and with every belief system too, you tend to have an echo chamber where you listen to people who already believe what you already believe, and you filter out untrustworthy sources uh, of information that might challenge your worldview. So I always encourage people to read outside their comfort zone. Uh, don't, read books on evolution written by scientists, not by, your church members if they are anti-evolutionists. You know, get a second opinion because, and this is something that I've done throughout my academic career. If I find someone who disagrees with me, I go out and read them because maybe they know something I don't. Maybe I can learn something. I'm always challenging my own beliefs. It's easy to challenge other people's beliefs. It's a lot harder to look in the mirror and say, is what I have been raised in and believed all my life, could that be true? Can that be improved? So that's what I am, educate yourself. Go outside your comfort zone. Listen to esoteric.
There's another one. There were actually two copies of Isaiah discovered in Cave 1, and they're pretty different. Interestingly enough, you'll hear apologists talk about the Great Isaiah Scroll like it's some sort of touchstone of inerrancy. I've heard huge number, like most apologists will talk about it being virtually identical to the Masoretic text of Isaiah. This is not true. It is so far from true. In the Great Isaiah Scroll, there are over 2,600 textual variants. And a number of these are actually, there's seven, or sorry, there's nine. What the original editor, what the editors called large insertions. And these are sections in the text where the scribe has been writing and he stops and he leaves a blank and then he continues, but there's a whole section of the text that we know of that's missing in the original manuscript. And in several of these places, somebody else has come along and added what was missing. What we've come to understand is that it's an amazing the Great Isaiah Scroll is an amazing manuscript, but not for the reasons you think. The Great Isaiah Scroll shows us that this was a manuscript that was copied from two different copies of the book of Isaiah. But interestingly, the first copy was only Isaiah 1 through 33. That was it. That was all that was there. The second copy that they copied from was Isaiah 34 through 66. So, and this aligns with what scholars have suspected for over 150 years now, that Isaiah was not just this, single book that was written. It was something that grew and expanded. It was actually multiple compositions included, in this scroll that continued to grow and change. But this second copy of the book of Isaiah looks like the one that this scribe was copying from was already damaged. So at the bottom of the sheet, it was missing, right? So he just he's like, well, you know, this continues, but I don't remember what it is, or I don't know what it is. So I'm just going to leave some space here and continue. And then somebody else came along and added the missing text. But what's really interesting is it looks like in several places the missing text that was added from memory. And as a result, there's mistakes in there that don't appear in Isaiah. So it's a crazy interesting manuscript, but it's one of these things. It bugs me to know when apologists will talk about the great Isaiah scroll and how it's virtually identical to the Bible, and it's such a simplistic understanding of what's actually going on there. There's so much going on there, and it's so interesting. And no, it doesn't excuse me, it doesn't match virtually what we have in the Bible. But
some of the passages in Joshua are shorter. Some of the passages in Kings are shorter. Some of the ones in Jeremiah, I think, may be longer. I mean, there's a lot of variation. And sometimes you have quotations of the Bible by Josephus that don't match the Masoretic text, but they do match these newly discovered fragments from the Dead Sea Scrolls. So we know that he had a version that is different than what we've inherited. That's one certainty. Yeah, so there's a lot of variation, and it's hard to tell which is the oldest and which is the most authentic in many cases.
and by implication, because a lot of this is a lot of what the Dead Sea Scrolls do, and what I think is super valuable about them, is they provide for us a snapshot of textual transmission from this 200-year, 300-year period of time. If we extrapolate backwards from what we see in the Dead Sea Scrolls, then it very naturally follows that the Hebrew Bible texts were not written piecemeal. They were the combination of sources. They were compiled over long periods of time. They were constantly added to and updated and contemporized. All this stuff is still taking place in texts that we have of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Psalm 22 is the psalm that the writers of the Passion narrative based Jesus crucifixion on, right? So there's lots of reflection of the language in there. Christians have come to think of this as a prophetic psalm, attesting to the crucifixion of Jesus hundreds of years before the invention of crucifixion. One of the verses in the psalm in the Hebrew, it says, let me just pull it up. I'll read it directly here. This is, in its original context, this is the psalmist, the writer, is crying out to God because he's being overwhelmed by his enemies, and he's crying out to God for deliverance and for reprieve from the people who are oppressing him. So he says things. I'm starting here in verse 14. They open their mouths at me like tearing, roaring lions. My life ebbs away. All my bones are disjointed, and my heart is like wax, melting within me. My vigor dries up like a shard. My tongue cleaves to my palate. You commit me to the dust of death. Dogs surround me. A pack of evil ones closes in on me. Like lions, they maul my hands and feet. I take count of all my bones while they look on and gloat. So And it goes on to say, they divide my clothes among themselves, casting lots for my garments. So, like, there's throughout this psalm, there's various touch points with what happened to Jesus, and as the gospel writers tell us in the crucifixion, they clearly have the psalm in mind as they're talking about this. So the Septuagint, like the translation of that one, those sets of lines in verse 17. Dogs surround me, a pack of evil ones closes in on me. Like lions, they maul my hands and my feet. There's a textual variant there in the Septuagint. It says, dogs surround me, a pack of evil ones closes in on me. They pierce my hands and my feet. So this is actually, and the Greek word there is it's not it's not a common word used for stabbing or piercing, right? It's the word more commonly is used of digging a hole, like in the ground, a grave most commonly. Um, and Christian apologists, you'll see this all over the place. They'll point to this passage from the Septuagint. They pierced my hands and my feet, as like this is the crucifixion, obviously, right? So, and in the Dead Sea Scrolls, there is a fragment from a copy of the Book of Psalms that was found at Mutabat. No, sorry, Nachal Hever. There was a copy found at Nachal Hever, and it looks like it preserves this reading in Hebrew. Um, the the reading that appears in the Septuagint. They pierced or they dug my hands and my feet. But as you can imagine, um, Christian apologists are all over this. They're like, look, the Dead Sea Scrolls show that this is the original text, and the this is actually a prophecy of the crucifixion of Jesus. It's such, again, this is such a simplistic way of reading the manuscript. More likely, this is a textual error. So there's like two very, very commonly occurring letters in Hebrew, a yod and a vav. They look in scripts from the period, like from the Second Temple period. There's lots of places where these letters look identical. So it's patently obvious what's going on here. The word for lion is kari. It's a kof, a resh, and a yod. The word for kari. It's a kof, and aleph, a resh, and a yod. The word for pierce is a kof, a resh, and a vav. So they look very similar. It's so obvious. A scribe mistook ka'ari, like a lion, and either wrote keru, they dug, or if it was the translator of the Septuagint, just translated, they dug, right? It's so obvious. Like, it's just a scribal mistake. And it's so stupid too, because it's the stupidest translation. They dug my hands and my feet. It's ridiculous. But this is one of those things that, for the longest time, I swear there may be a handful before me, but as far as I know, nobody was drawing any attention to this before me. And I'm like, come on. This is But there's tons of stuff like this.
Well, my first published article as a researcher was called "The War Scroll and Roman Weaponry Reconsidered." The War Scroll is an amazing document. It's 19 columns. It lays out the military tactics of the army of the Sons of Light that they were to use in their war against the Sons of Darkness, an apocalyptic battle between the forces of Belial and their allies. The first 9 or so columns are taken up with military tactics and weaponry and formations that are very similar to Roman tactica or military manuals. And then some of the later chapters are more primitive, with armies clashing with the enemy through the blowing of trumpets and the high priest giving speeches to the army ahead of battle and this and that. So it's the text went through a few different editions, but the latest version had a lot in common with Roman military manuals. And it's the person who created the critical edition was just an amazing character, General Yigal Yadin, an Israeli general and the foremost military expert in Israel at the time. He published the critical edition, and he concluded from these Roman weapons and tactics that the war scroll must have been written after Rome took over Judea in 67 BC under Pompey. So that's a lot of background. My article showed no, it was written a century earlier, that the tactics and weaponry and formations reflect the earlier Republican armies rather than the later Roman cohort armies in the time of Pompey. They fought in three lines of troops with their cavalry associated on the side and their light armor. And anyway, it's a very systematic resemblance of the earlier Roman tactics rather than the later. So my article was really immediately accepted. I get to overthrow the theories of the foremost military expert in Israel. It was pretty cool. And that led to my being an invited speaker at an international congress in Jerusalem and this and that. So I'm mostly known for the war scroll. Before I got sidetracked in my biblical researches.
So there's actually what I did my PhD dissertation on a set of manuscripts that preserve a text about the prophet Jeremiah that's been called the Apocryphon of Jeremiah by scholars. And within the copies, there's 5 copies. Within the copies, you can see the types of editorial changes taking place that we hypothesized or predicted about, the book of Deuteronomy or the books of Genesis and Exodus, right? We have actual examples of these. To say that I could go on and on about also, like the War Scroll is an example of a text which we can see the development of it from, an earlier stage to a later stage. And we're talking about 100 years with some of these texts. So it's foolish to think that, for 800 years of biblical history, people were just meticulously copying exactly what was written and just handing that down from generation to generation. And then all of a sudden, in the Second Temple period, everybody started to go crazy and make these wild changes and start to handle their text differently. It makes much more sense to say what we see happening in the Second Temple period is the exact same thing that was happening before that and after that. So it's it's pretty cool. So